The bathroom was my refuge, a quiet corner of the sprawling countryside house I'd called home for years. Slate tiles gleamed under my bare feet, cool and smooth, while the wide windows framed a misty valley stretching out beyond the glass. The morning sun slipped through, painting the room in soft gold, warming my skin as I stood before the mirror. My blonde hair tumbled over my shoulders, catching the light in loose waves, a familiar sight I'd grown to love. I reached for the satin robe draped over my arm, letting its smooth fabric slide through my fingers before I shrugged it off. It pooled at my feet, a whisper of blue against the dark floor, leaving me bare and unhurried. This was my ritual, a moment to breathe before the day took hold. I turned the shower knob, and water hissed to life, a steady rush that mingled with the faint trill of birds outside. Steam curled upward, thick and warm, wrapping me in its embrace as I stepped under the spray. The heat kissed my skin, tracing paths down my arms and back, waking every nerve with a gentle hum. I tilted my head, letting the water soak through my hair, the scent of pine drifting in from the valley, blending with the clean sharpness of my soap. My hands moved lazily, smoothing the suds over my shoulders, my movements fluid, almost a dance. This was my space, my sanctuary, where the world beyond those windows couldn't touch me, or so I thought. A shadow flickered in the corner of my eye, sharp against the soft haze. I turned, water streaming down my face, and there he was, Mason, my stepson, standing in the doorway. His tall frame filled the space, broad shoulders cutting a silhouette through the steam. Our eyes locked, his hazel stare slicing through the mist, steady and unblinking. My breath caught, a jolt running through me as the air shifted, heavy with something I couldn't name. I stood frozen, one hand resting against the wet glass, the other hovering near my chest, not quite covering myself. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. His gaze tracing me, slow and deliberate, like a man seeing something for the first time. The steam clung to me, outlining every curve, amplifying the heat that suddenly felt too much. My pulse hammered in my throat, loud against the steady drum of the water. I'd known Mason since he was a lanky kid, all elbows and shy smiles, but that boy was gone. At 19, he'd grown into something else. Tall, solid, with a jaw that carried a shadow of stubble and eyes that burned with a quiet intensity. And now here he was, staring at me like I wasn't just Grace, the woman who'd raised him, but someone new, someone exposed. Mason! His name slipped out, low and rough, barely audible over the shower's song. He flinched like I'd startled him, but his eyes didn't waver. Grace, he said, his voice catching, deep and uncertain. It hung there, a thread stretched tight between us. I swallowed, forcing my tone steady, even as my heart thundered. You didn't knock, Mason. He shifted, one hand gripping the doorframe, knuckles whitening. I didn't mean, I was just... His words stumbled, then stopped, his gaze dipping briefly before snapping back to mine. The space between us crackled, alive with a current neither of us could ignore. I should have turned away, grabbed a towel, ended it right there. But I didn't. I stood there, water dripping from my hair, my skin prickling under his stare, and felt something stir, a flush creeping up my neck, a warmth that wasn't just from the shower. He took a half step forward, then stopped, caught in the pull of the moment. I could see it in his face, the flicker of shock, the spark of something darker, hungrier. My own breath grew shallow, the steam pressing in, making the room feel smaller, closer. For a heartbeat, we were statues, locked in a silent dance, the valley outside forgotten, the birds drowned out by the rush in my ears. Then the phone rang downstairs, a shrill, insistent chime that sliced through the haze. Mason blinked, his head jerking toward the sound. I turned, reaching for the robe on the counter, my fingers brushing the damp satin as I pulled it close. The fabric stuck to my wet skin, a flimsy shield as I glanced back. He was already retreating, his footsteps soft on the hardwood, but his eyes lingered a second longer, leaving an imprint I couldn't shake. I tightened the robe's tie, the knot trembling under my hands. The water still ran behind me, a steady whisper against the tiles, but the room felt different now, charged, alive. I stepped to the window, peering out at the valley's rolling green, and let out a slow breath. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to shift back. The bathroom glowed with the late morning light, the sun climbing higher over the valley and spilling gold across the slate tiles. I stood by the counter, the memory of Mason's eyes still a hot coal in my chest, smoldering beneath my ribs. The windows framed the wooded expanse outside, mist curling through the pines like a lover's whisper. I ran my fingers through my damp blonde hair, letting it fall loose, and caught my reflection in the mirror. Flushed cheeks, a spark in my green eyes I hadn't seen in years. The shower waited, its promise of heat tugging at me. But this time, it wasn't just about routine. I slipped the satin robe off again, letting it crumple onto the counter, and turned the water on. The hiss filled the room, sharp and steady, as steam rose in lazy tendrils. I left the door ajar, not wide, just a crack, enough to let the warm air spill into the hall. It wasn't an accident. My heart thudded as I stepped under the spray, the water sluicing over my shoulders, tracing paths down my spine. I moved with purpose now, not the careless grace of earlier, but something deliberate, calculated. The soap smelled of lavender this time, its scent mingling with the earthy tang of the valley drifting through the open window. I lathered my arms, my neck, my hands gliding slow and smooth, picturing those hazel eyes watching from the shadows. And then I felt it. A prickle along my nape, a shift in the air. He was there. I didn't turn, didn't need to. The steam thickened, wrapping me in a hazy veil, but I knew Mason stood just beyond the threshold, his presence a quiet heat against the cool tiles. My pulse quickened, a rhythm matching the water's drum. I tilted my head, letting the spray catch my hair, and called out, soft as a breeze through the pines. "Mason, I know you're there. Don't just stand in the shadows. Come closer." A beat of silence, then his voice, low and unsteady, cut through the hiss. I didn't mean to—" "Oh, but you can," I said, turning my head just enough to catch his silhouette in the steam. His broad frame hesitated, one hand braced against the doorframe. I smiled, a small teasing curve of my lips, and let my tone warm like the water on my skin. "Why only watch when you could help?" He stepped forward, slow, like a man crossing a line he'd only dreamed of. The steam parted around him, revealing his face. Those sharp cheekbones, the faint stubble on his jaw, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and something deeper, hungrier. I turned my back to him, offering a view of my shoulders, water beading on my skin like tiny jewels. "Here," I said, holding out the sponge over my shoulder, my voice dipping low. "I could use a hand." His fingers brushed mine as he took it, tentative, trembling. The first touch was light, a whisper of the sponge against my back, barely grazing me. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation sink in, the warmth of the water, the faint scratch of the sponge, the weight of his gaze. "Like that?" he asked, his voice rough, closer now. "Mm-hmm," I murmured, leaning back just a fraction, encouraging him. "Take your time, Mason. There's no rush, is there?" His movements steadied, the sponge sliding in slow circles, tracing the curve of my spine. I felt his breath, warm and uneven, against my ear as he stepped nearer. The steam pressed in, blurring the edges of the room, making it just us, two figures in a world of heat and haze. His chest brushed my back, a fleeting press of cotton against my wet skin, and I bit my lip, stifling a shiver. The sponge dipped lower, then paused, his hand hovering as if testing the air between us. I turned my head, meeting his eyes over my shoulder. They were darker now, pupils wide, reflecting the glint of water on my skin. "You're doing fine," I said, my voice a sultry purr, steady despite the flutter in my chest. "Don't stop." He nodded, a small jerk of his chin, and resumed, his touch bolder now, the sponge gliding with a quiet confidence. The water poured over us both, soaking the edge of his shirt, but he didn't pull away. I arched slightly, letting the motion speak for me, a silent invitation he couldn't miss. His free hand rested on my shoulder, just for a moment, steadying himself, and I felt the heat of his palm like a brand. The air thickened, heavy with lavender and unspoken things. I turned fully then, facing him, the sponge slipping from his hand to the tile with a soft thud. Water dripped from my hair, tracing lines down my chest, and his eyes followed, then snapped back to mine. "Grace," he started, his voice a rasp, but I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch, charged and alive. "You don't have to just watch," I said, stepping closer, the steam swirling between us. His breath hitched, his hands flexing at his sides like he wanted to reach out but didn't dare. I smiled again, softer this time, and stepped out of the shower, brushing past him. My wet shoulder grazed his arm, leaving a damp mark on his sleeve. I grabbed a towel from the rack, wrapping it around me as I glanced back. He stood there, rooted, his shirt clinging to his chest, eyes locked on me like I'd just rewritten the rules of our world. I left the bathroom, the towel soft against my skin, my steps light on the hardwood. The valley outside shimmered in the sun, but inside, the air still hummed with what we'd started. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. I knew he'd follow, one way or another. The house settled into stillness as evening draped itself over the valley, shadows stretching long and soft across the hardwood floors. I stood at the base of the staircase, one hand resting on the polished oak railing, its smooth grain cool under my fingers. The day's heat lingered in my bones, Mason's eyes still a vivid imprint behind my lids, those hazel depths that had followed me from the bathroom, hungry and unsure. The air carried a faint chill now, the scent of pine creeping in through a cracked window, mingling with the fading trace of lavender on my skin. I took a slow breath, feeling it mist faintly in the dim light, and let my gaze drift upward toward the hallway. His look had stayed with me all day, a quiet fire that wouldn't fade. I'd caught glimpses of him around the house, passing in the kitchen, brushing by in the yard, each moment taut with something unsaid. Now, with the world outside hushed and the crickets starting their song, I felt a pull, a need to face it head on. My fingers tightened on the railing, nails pressing into the wood, and I started up the stairs, my bare feet silent against the steps. The house seemed to hold its breath, the creak of the floorboards a faint echo in the stillness, as if it knew what I was about to do. Mason's room was at the end of the corridor. His door cracked open just enough to spill a sliver of lamplight onto the floor. I paused, my hand hovering near the knob, the weight of the moment settling over me like a heavy coat. The memory of his touch, the sponge gliding over my back, his breath against my ear, flashed through me, quick and sharp. I pushed the door wider, the hinges giving a soft groan, and stepped inside. He stood by the window, his back to me, moonlight outlining his frame. The broad line of his shoulders tapered to a slim waist, his dark shirt catching the pale glow. The room smelled of him, clean cotton and a hint of the outdoors, earthy and alive. I cleared my throat, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mason." He turned, the lamplight catching his face, softening the hard edge of his jaw. His eyes met mine, steady now, the boyish uncertainty I'd once known replaced by something deeper, more resolute. "Grace," he said, his voice low and even, resonating in the quiet space between us. I took a step forward, the hardwood cool under my feet, and held his gaze, daring myself to speak. "About tomorrow morning," I started, my throat tightening, the words heavy on my tongue. "I was thinking we could keep going." I paused, my breath catching, then pushed on, gathering the shards of my nerve. "Maybe continue what we started." The silence stretched, thick and charged, his eyes searching mine. I could see the storm behind them, desire wrestling with doubt. The weight of what we both knew lingered beneath the surface. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, a statue carved from moonlight and shadow. My heart pounded, each beat loud in my ears, and I rushed to fill the void, my voice softening, almost pleading. "Only if you want to. I know it's different, but I thought maybe—" I trailed off, letting the implication hang, raw and exposed. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the stubble, And then he spoke, his voice steady, but threaded with a tremble he couldn't hide. "I'd like that." Simple words, but they carried a weight that sank into me, a promise wrapped in quiet fire. Relief flooded through me, warm and sudden, drowning the knot of fear in my chest. "You would?" I asked, my voice a soft breath, careful not to break the fragile thread we'd spun. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine, a flicker of determination lighting them. "Yeah, I'd like that a lot." The air grew thick again, not with tension now, but with anticipation, a shared understanding settling between us like dust after a storm. I forced a smile, my lips trembling slightly, and he took a step closer, his hand brushing my arm, just a graze, but it sent a shiver racing down my spine. His fingers lingered there, warm against my skin, and I felt that pull again, stronger now, magnetic and undeniable. "Good night, Grace," he said, his voice a low caress, wrapping around me like the night itself. It carried a promise, a hint of what tomorrow might hold, and my breath caught in my throat. "Good night, Mason," I replied, my words barely a whisper. Swallowed by the heavy atmosphere of the room, I turned, stepping back into the hall, my bare feet tracing the path I'd come.